Well, let's cross live now to Washington. Our correspondent there is Kethevane Gorjestani. And Kethevane, we've been hearing all day that harsh EU sanctions are planned very shortly. What should we expect from the White House?
Well, we should expect full-scale sanctions. That's what some U.S. officials are saying to respond to a full-scale invasion by the Russians. Joe Biden is expected to speak later on today. This morning, he convened his National Security Council to get more updates on the situation on the ground. And he also had some of the officials from his national economic advisors. And so there was some discussion as to what those sanctions would be like. Then currently, if that meeting is on schedule, there's the virtual meeting with the G7 to talk a little bit about those coordinated efforts at sanctions. And then we should be hearing from the president himself. He is expected to be speaking from the East Room, and he is expected to announce those sanctions. Now, we don't have the specifics exactly of what those sanctions will be, but some of the options still on the table that were not in the first wave of sanctions announced a couple of days ago include export controls, the possibility, of course, of removing Russia from the SWIFT banking system, which would be a huge blow to the Russian economy, possibly more personal sanctions, even the possibility of direct sanctions on Vladimir Putin. But we will hear more from the president, and the expectation is that we will get a big round of heavy sanctions, probably those swift and severe sanctions that the U.S. has been talking about for the past weeks and even months now.
What about a military response from the United States, Kethevane? We've heard from the Secretary General today of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, saying that the eastern flank of NATO is to be beefed up. Should we expect more U.S. troops in Eastern Europe?
Yes, and that is already underway. Yesterday, the Pentagon press secretary confirmed, or I should say gave more details about that order that President Biden talked about in his speech, ordering troop and equipment movement to shore up NATO's eastern flank. So it was very specific. These will be troops and equipment that is already stationed all across the NATO members and Eastern Europe, but trying to move them closer to that line, basically, with Russia. So you have, for example, about 800 U.S. troops that were stationed in Italy that are being moved to the three Baltic states, who are, of course, on the front line, basically, because they have those common borders with Russia. There are also movements of fighter jets, helicopters coming from places like Germany or Greece and being sent over to Poland and the Baltic states. And that is a move that Joe Biden a couple of days ago called a defensive move, that there was no intention of fighting Russia. But this, of course, was before the Russian invasion. These shoring up of troops is likely to continue, but so far the president insisting yet again that there will not be any U.S. troops in Ukraine, no U.S. troops to fight Russia. But we might also, besides the sanctions, be hearing more about those troop movements. But right now, there's no idea that there would be U.S. troops sent over from the United States. But remember, there are those U.S. troops based here in the U.S. that are on heightened alert should NATO request them for their rapid response force.
Kethevane, just finally, there's sort of relatively sizable Ukrainian community in the United States. I understand you've been speaking with a few members of the community. I mean, there must be just real concern right now for family and friends in Ukraine. Tell us what you've been hearing.
Yes, I was actually at an impromptu protest where Ukrainians just gathered over social media. It was around 1 a.m. Last night after the news of the Russian invasion came to be. They gathered in front of the Russian embassy. There were not that many people, about 50 people. It was very cold. It was late at night, but they were there with those Ukrainian flags. There were also members of other former Soviet nations who were there in support. And really the feeling from the people that I spoke to was a mix of sadness and fear for their families, because most of these Ukrainians still have families there, still have friends there, saying that a lot of them actually called their families, woke them up to tell them, because they had already seen the news back here in the U.S., and they were telling their families and friends to go to shelters and to avoid as much as possible anything that looked like a government building, a military building, any infrastructure that could be the target. So they were really fearful for their families and friends, but there was also a lot of anger and a lot of requests from the United States and from NATO and from the Europeans. They said, we've been asking you for harsher sanctions. That's what we have wanted. So far, it was not enough. It did not deter Vladimir Putin. Now is the time to hit, and hit very hard. And that is why they were gathered in front of the Russian embassy to tell Russia, tell Putin to get his hands off Ukraine. That's what they said. But also to give a message to the U.S. president to really impose those very harsh sanctions. There's already, I have been told by some members of that Ukrainian community, that there will be another protest planned for this afternoon, this time in front of the White House, to give that message directly to Joe Biden.